This is the Heretic's Fork. It was a tool designed by the Inquisition to silence those who dared to speak out against the church. Now, this is a replica, but the real Heretic's Fork was sharp and it would dig upwards into the chin and down into the chest so that the sinner was unable to speak. Back then, instead of getting shadow banned, you'd get one of these. But the question is, what blasphemous secrets was the Inquisition trying to silence? Well, see, in the dark halls of the Inquisition archives, hidden away for centuries, a mysterious book was discovered known as Interrogatio Johannes, or the Secret Supper. And this book belonged to a heretical group of Christians called the Cathars. They believed it contained the true teachings of Jesus Christ that was kept hidden from the world. But what were those teachings, and why would the church that supposedly built on Christ's teachings hide this book? This is the Satanic Bible, written by Anton LaVey in 1969, and in it, LaVey writes that if the devil were a liar, then it would have been Satan, not God, who wrote the Holy Bible. And that's exactly what the Cathars believed. For them, the actual Satanic Bible is the Bible itself. Now that might sound crazy, but the Cathars were not the first Christians who believed that. This is the world's first Bible. And what if I told you that the man who created the world's first Bible would agree that the Bible that we have today is evil, twisted, and corrupted by dark forces? And then there were the Gnostics, who were ancient Christian mystics that believed that the being that the church worshipped was actually the devil in disguise. The Gnostics formed secret societies where they taught hidden knowledge that the church tried to destroy. But what was that hidden knowledge? Today we're exploring the heretical beliefs of the Cathars, the truth about the world's first Bible, and the secrets of the Gnostics to uncover the Bible's shocking satanic origins. And we'll answer the question, is God actually the devil? My name is Morgue, and I'm an ex-Christian revealing hidden knowledge to create a new world. Remember to like and subscribe to help spread this information, and check out my new book, Neogenesis: Dawn of the New Mind. The link is in the description of this video. Do you know why the Inquisition was created? It was a powerful institution established by the Catholic Church in the 12th century, and it was designed to root out heresy, blasphemy, and witchcraft. And the Inquisition was known for using violence and torture to extract confessions from heretics, enforcing religious conformity through fear and brutality. Now, you probably knew that already, but did you know who their primary targets were? The Cathars. But why was the church so terrified of the Cathars? Imagine this. It's the Middle Ages, and the church has a stranglehold on Europe. Heretics are burned at the stake, but in the shadows, there's a group whispering that the God we know might not be the true God. See, the Cathars believed that Satan had twisted the scriptures and that the God worshipped by the church was actually the devil. In their book, The Secret Supper, which was seized by the Inquisition, it describes how Satan manipulated humanity into believing that he was God. So the Cathar interpretation of the Bible is the total opposite of what we've been taught. It's kind of like how we have different political parties today, where each one says the other is evil. The Cathars were saying, hey, what if what the world has been told about the Bible is just propaganda by Satan? For them, the Bible was fake news. Now that might sound crazy, but think about it. Growing up as a Christian, I was always taught that the Bible was the ultimate truth, but as I got older, I started questioning why the supposedly holy word of God would contain so much violence. Doesn't that seem suspicious? In the Bible, God demanded blood sacrifices, commanded the death of innocent men, women, and children, unleashed plagues and floods to destroy humanity. I remember sitting in church and hearing these stories about blood sacrifices and thinking, well, isn't that exactly what the church calls satanic? It always felt wrong. Why would a loving God constantly demand sacrifice and worship? But what if that wasn't God at all? What if that was actually the devil? That makes a lot more sense. After all, does accepting animal and human sacrifice sound godly or satanic? The Bible is said to be inspired by God, but what if it was inspired by Satan to deceive humanity? According to the Cathars, this is exactly the case. Remember the war in heaven? The battle where Satan rebelled against God? Well, we've all heard this story. Satan rebelled against God and was cast out of heaven, but the Cathars had a completely different take. According to the Cathars, they believed that Satan, who's usually depicted as the rebel angel, was actually the God of the Bible, the very God who demanded sacrifices, unquestioning obedience, and worship. In their eyes, this God was not the true God, but an evil imposter, the devil himself. They called him Rex Mundi, or King of the World. But wait a minute, if the God of the Bible is actually Satan, then who did he rebel against in heaven? Well, it's all revealed in the book that terrified the church and hidden away by the Inquisition, The Secret Supper. The Secret Supper is also known as the Questions of John, because in this book, John has a secret meal in heaven with Jesus who reveals hidden information. But what was it that Jesus revealed? Well, Jesus tells John that there is a higher God, the true God, the God of light who created everything spiritual, while Satan is a false god of darkness who created the material world and human beings. But hold on, how did Satan create human beings? Well, he couldn't create anything spiritual. He could only make the material bodies. But the bodies needed a soul, otherwise they just lay there like lifeless dolls. So to give life to his creation, Satan trapped the souls of fallen angels in material bodies, which means according to the Cathars, you and I and everyone are actually fallen angels. The Secret Supper says, Satan commanded the earth to bring forth all living things, animals, trees, and herbs, and he pondered on making man to serve him. He took clay of the earth and made man like unto himself, and he then bade an angel of the second heaven to enter the body of clay. Of this body he took a part and made another body in the form of a woman, and bade an angel of the first heaven to enter into it. And the angels grieved deeply that they thus had a mortal form imposed upon them, and that they now existed in different forms. As angelic souls trapped in physical bodies, the question is it possible to escape? Well, according to the Cathars, even death didn't release the soul from the prison of the material world because they believed in reincarnation and thought that angelic souls were trapped in a cycle of rebirth in the material world, a concept that was considered heretical by the Catholic Church. And they could only escape from this cycle by rejecting the material world and realizing their true divine origins. The Cathars practiced a ritual called the consolamentum, which was a form of spiritual baptism that they believed purified the soul, and this ritual was usually performed just before death, as it was believed to be the key to escaping the material world and returning to the realm of the true God. Now, unlike the Catholic Church, the Cathars allowed women to serve as spiritual leaders. Women, called prefectae, could administer the consolamentum and were highly respected within Cathar communities. But now that Satan had trapped fallen angels in the form of human beings, he needed a way to convince them to worship him, to trick them into believing he was God. But how? The Secret Supper reveals that Satan began to have books written to deceive humanity. In the Bible, Enoch is a holy man who's taken to heaven without dying, but in the Secret Supper, Enoch is revealed to actually be a servant of Satan. The devil takes him up into the clouds and commands him to write books to fulfill his plan to brainwash humanity into believing that he's God. The Secret Supper says, Satan then commanded that Enoch be given quill and ink. Seating himself, Enoch wrote 76 books. These the devil bade him to take to the earth. What were these books about? They taught about blood sacrifices. Now remember, the Old Testament of the Bible is filled with blood sacrifices. Why would a loving God be so obsessed with sacrifice? That's crazy. Think about the story of Cain and Abel, where God rejects Cain's offering of vegetables and instead favors Abel's offering of a lamb. Not to mention the countless animal sacrifices in Leviticus, where specific instructions are given for sacrificing bulls and goats and lambs to atone for sins and seek favor from God. Leviticus 1:5 and 1:13 says, You are to slaughter the young bull before the Lord. The priest shall bring the blood and splash it against the sides of the altar. Burn them on the altar. It is a burnt offering, a food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. I'm sorry, what? When I was a Christian, I remember reading verses like this and wondering how a loving God could possibly demand sacrifices. And if that's not enough for you, there's the story of Jephthah, where he ends up sacrificing his own virgin daughter as a burnt offering. I mean, come on, you can't get more satanic than that, a burnt virgin sacrifice. Hello? Really think about that. Why is this considered acceptable? Well, it wasn't for the Cathars. They saw this as totally evil and believed that the idea of sacrifice, whether animals or humans, was a deception by Satan. They believed that true salvation wasn't about performing these satanic rituals, it was about understanding and realizing one's own divine nature. Remember the 10 Commandments that God supposedly gave to Moses? The Cathars believed that the devil tricked Moses and created them as a deception. The Secret Supper says, And the devil revealed to Moses his divinity and bade him give laws to the children of Israel and lead them. But the devil's plan didn't stop at filling scriptures with deception and violence. He had to convince the world that he was God. How did he do this? By systematically brainwashing humanity. Let me explain. According to the Secret Supper, Jesus tells John that the devil deceived the world by declaring that he was the only God. The Secret Supper says, "And he, the devil, said to them, 'See you that I am God, and there is no other God beside me.'" This is crucial because in the Old Testament, God says this all the time. In the Bible, specifically Isaiah chapter 45, he says it over and over. Here, let me show you. Verse 5, "I am the Lord and there is no other. Apart from me, there is no God." Verse 6, "I am the Lord and there is no other." Verse 14, "Surely God is with you and there is no other. There is no other God." Verse 18, "I am the Lord and there is no other." Verse 21, "And there is no God apart from me, a righteous God and a Savior. There is none but me." Verse 22, "For I am God and there is no other." You get the idea, and that's just one chapter. So you get the picture. When I first read verses like this, I wondered why an all-powerful God would say this over and over again. It almost felt like overcompensating, like maybe he's trying to hide something. So according to the Cathars, the devil was the world's first catfish. But the question is, how does Jesus fit into all this? Isn't he supposed to be the Son of God? Well, the Cathars believe that Jesus was the son of the true God of light, not the satanic God of the Bible. They believe that Jesus came to expose the devil's lies and to bring humanity knowledge about our true spiritual nature. In the Secret Supper, Jesus says, "My Father sent me to this world to make manifest his name to men, that they might recognize the devil and his wickedness." As you can imagine, Satan wasn't very happy about this, and this is where the crucifixion comes in. The Cathars believed that Satan saw Jesus as a huge threat and he could expose his lies, so he hatched a plan to have him crucified. The Secret Supper says, "When Satan learned that I had come down to this world, he sent his angel to take 3 pieces of wood. These he gave to the prophet Moses for my crucifixion. This wood they have kept for me until the present." So the Cathars actually completely rejected the cross as a holy symbol. They saw it as an instrument of torture and part of the satanic plot to destroy Jesus. But think about it. Wearing a cross around your neck would be like wearing a miniature electric chair. The cross is a symbol of execution. Some Cathars even destroyed the cross. The Cathar Pierre Authier said, "Just as a man should with an axe break the gallows on which his father was hanged, so you ought to try and break crucifixes because Christ was suspended from it." Well, guess what happened to Pierre? He was arrested by an inquisitor and burned at the stake for heresy. So if the Cathars revered Jesus, why are his teachings in the Bible if it's the work of Satan? Well, the Bible is divided into 2 parts, the New Testament and the Old Testament. And have you ever noticed how different they are? They're almost total opposites. The Old Testament is filled with stories of violence and wrath and strict laws and bloody sacrifices, where God's demanding obedience and punishing people and waging wars and demanding worship. And this, the Cathars believed, was the work of Satan, the false god who wanted to control and deceive humanity. But the New Testament is completely different. It's about love and forgiveness. And Jesus preached about light, the true path to salvation, and that the kingdom of heaven is found within each of us. The Cathars believed that while parts of the New Testament had also been twisted by the influence of the false god, Satan, some of it still contained the true teachings of Jesus, the Son of the higher God of light, who came to reveal the path to enlightenment and liberation from the material world. So the Cathars believed that the material world was inherently evil because it was created by Satan, who twisted the scriptures to deceive humanity into believing that he was God. The Cathars believed that we're all fallen angels and saw human bodies as prisons for the soul, which was originally divine and pure. So the goal of life, according to the Cathars, was to escape the material world and return to the spiritual realm of the true God, and they saw Jesus as a messenger from the true God, helping humanity to remember their divine origins. Now, here's the important part. These beliefs might seem radical, and they were, but what if I told you that the Cathars weren't the only ones who believed this? That this knowledge is actually ancient. In 1945, buried near the tombs of Egypt, a collection of ancient heretical books was found. These books, now known as the Nag Hammadi Library, were likely buried to hide them from the church, who tried to eradicate them completely. So what were these books? These books belonged to a heretical group of early Christians that existed long before the Cathars, known as Gnostics. Now, growing up, I remember hearing about agnostics, who are people who don't know if God exists or not, but the Gnostics were completely different. Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. So the Gnostics were the ones who know. know. But what did they know? The Gnostics emerged around 1,000 years before the Cathars, specifically during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, and they set the stage for the Cathars' radical beliefs. They claimed to know the secret teachings of Jesus and formed secret societies where they taught his hidden knowledge. But what were those secrets? The Gnostics had many secret books, and one of them was similar to the Cathars' Secret Supper, and it was known as the Secret Book of John, where you guessed it, Jesus reveals secret teachings to John. Jesus reveals that there exists a hierarchy of divine beings known as eons, who are emanations from the true God of light, and that we're all divine pieces of this God. But there are also beings of darkness known as archons, or rulers, who trapped us in the material world. The first and most powerful archon was called the Demiurge, which means creator. See, the Gnostics believed that the material world was the creation of this evil, satanic being who was none other than the God of the Old Testament. Sound familiar? In the Secret Book of John, Jesus points out that the false God claimed to be the only God, but that he contradicted himself when he commanded that humanity worship no other gods because he's a jealous God. See, in the Bible, specifically Exodus 20:3-5, God says, "You shall have no other gods before me, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God." And Exodus 34:14 says, "Do not worship any other god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." Well, this sounds more like an abusive boyfriend than a loving God. In the Secret Book of John, Jesus points out the big problem here. Jesus says, "The Demiurge said, 'I am a jealous God, and there is no other God beside me.' But by announcing this, he indicated to the angels who attended him that there exists another God. For if there were no other one, of whom would he be jealous?" According to the Gnostics, this dark satanic god screwed up by saying that he's a jealous god because he let it slip that there are other gods to be jealous of. And besides, why would a supposedly perfect god be jealous anyway? It sounds more like someone that needs therapy than a god. Like the Cathars, the Gnostics believed much of the scripture was twisted by the Demiurge to deceive humanity into believing he was God. The Gnostics even said that this evil being sinned against the world when he said he was the only God. Another Gnostic text, called The Reality of the Rulers, says, "It is I who am God, there is none apart from me." When he said this, he sinned against the entirety. In other words, since we're all pieces of the true God of light, that means all of us are gods. And so when the Demiurge said that he was the only God, he sinned against everything, because he isn't the only God, since we're all divine. So according to the Gnostics, God was the first sinner, not Adam and Eve. In another Gnostic text, the Testimony of Truth, they actually list out evidence from the story of the Garden of Eden to show that the Creator is a false God. First, it accuses God of withholding knowledge from humanity. The fact that God makes knowledge off limits should be a huge red flag. The book asks, why would God make knowledge forbidden? The Testimony of Truth says, but what sort is this God? First, he maliciously refused Adam from eating from the tree of knowledge. The book then goes on to show that God is a liar and is not all-knowing. See, after Adam eats from the tree of knowledge, God tries to find Adam and asks, where are you? Well, an omniscient, all-knowing God would already know where Adam was. The Testimony of Truth says, secondly, he said, Adam, where are you? God does not have foreknowledge? Would he not know from the beginning? It then calls God a malicious grudger because he casts Adam and Eve out of the garden, holding a grudge and never allowing them to return. The Testimony of Truth says, surely he has shown himself to be a malicious grudger, and what kind of God is this? See, the Testimony of Truth keeps saying, what kind of God is this, and of what sort is this God, because the book is trying to get the reader to think logically and wake up to the fact that these aren't the actions of a good God, but of a villain, a tyrant, a devil. The Testimony of Truth goes on to say that those who hear the story of the Garden of Eden and don't realize the evil of this so-called God are blind. It points out how cruel this God is, even to those who serve him. The Testimony of Truth says, and what kind of God is this? For great is the blindness of those who read, and they did not know him. And he said, I am the jealous God. I will bring the sins of the fathers upon the children until 3 and 4 generations. And he said, I will make their heart thick, and I will cause their mind to become blind, that they might not know nor comprehend the things that are said. But these things he has said to those who believe in him and serve him. The Testimony of Truth is shouting to the reader, how can you read the story of the Garden of Eden and think that God is the good guy? Hello? This false God is literally making knowledge forbidden. I remember when I came across the Gnostics, it was incredible. Here were people who were pointing out the same things that I had been thinking when I was a Christian. They weren't just accepting what they were told, they were questioning it, challenging it, and looking for deeper hidden truths. I also remember wondering why the message of Jesus was so different from the God of the Old Testament. So, according to the Gnostics, how does Jesus fit into all this? Well, like the Cathars, the Gnostics believed that Jesus was a messenger from the true God of light, not the demiurge, but that this message was twisted by his disciples. In fact, the Gnostics saw the disciples of Jesus as being totally evil. They claimed that the disciples didn't understand Christ's message and worshipped the demiurge. In the Gnostic book, The Gospel of Judas, there's a passage where Jesus actually laughs at the disciples' prayers and tells them that they don't know who he is or the God he comes from. The Gospel of Judas says, "The disciples said to him, 'Master, why are you laughing at our prayer?' He answered and said to them, 'I'm not laughing at you. You're not doing this because you want to, but because your God will be praised.' They said, 'Master, you are the Son of our God.' Jesus said, 'How do you know me? Truly, I say to you, no generation of the people among you will know me.' When his disciples heard this, they started to get angry and furious and started to curse him in their hearts. But when Jesus noticed their ignorance, he said to them, 'Why are you letting your anger trouble you? Has your God within you become angry with your souls?' Jesus then takes Judas aside and tells him about the realm that he actually comes from. Jesus said, 'Come, that I may teach you about secrets no person has ever seen. For there exists a great and boundless realm, whose extent no generation of angels has seen, in which there is a great invisible spirit, which no eye of an angel has ever seen, no thought of the heart has ever comprehended, and it was never called by any name.'" So according to the Gnostics, Jesus didn't come to die for our sins, but rather to reveal hidden knowledge, to awaken the divine spark within all of us so that we all can realize that we are God. Achieving gnosis, or secret knowledge, allows us to transcend the material world and reunite with the pleroma, our true home, the realm of divine light. So in early Christianity, the idea that the creator God was evil and Jesus came from a higher God was spreading fast. In fact, did you know that the world's first Bible was actually based on this very idea? As early Christianity was just beginning to take shape in the 1st and 2nd centuries, someone stepped forward who challenged everything people thought they knew about God, and this man was Saint Marcion. Marcion was a theologian, and he had a radical vision, but what exactly did he see that others didn't? Well, as Marcion studied the scriptures and read about all the violence and bloodshed, he uncovered something shocking. He believed that the God of what would become the Old Testament and the God of Jesus were completely different beings. The Old Testament God, according to Marcion, was the demiurge, a wrathful, vengeful creator obsessed with control. But the God that Jesus spoke of was a God of light, love, and liberation. So if these two gods were so different, what did Marcion do about it? Marcion compiled the first Christian canon. In other words, he put together the world's first Bible. Now, what made this Bible so controversial? Well, Marcion completely rejected the books that would later become the Old Testament. Why? Because he believed they were the works of the demiurge, not the true God. Instead, he created a new canon, which included only a shorter version of Luke's Gospel in a section that he called the Evangelicon, and 10 of Paul's epistles in a section called the Apostolicon. If we took today's Bible and removed all the texts that Marcion rejected as being evil or twisted by the demiurge, it would look like this. Marcion compiled the world's first Bible like this to remove the influence of the demiurge, emphasizing that Christ's true message was about freeing humanity from this dark, oppressive, evil deity. In Marcion's view, Jesus wasn't here to enforce the old laws of the demiurge, he was here to break us free. Like the Gnostics, Marcion believed that the disciples had misunderstood Christ's teachings and twisted them to fit the agenda of the demiurge. Historian Bart Ehrman said, Marcion believed that after Jesus left this earth, his followers, the disciples, changed his teachings, misinterpreting his gospel message. They never fully understood Jesus' teaching that the Creator was not the true God. But how did Marcion convince others that this was the truth? Well, to back up his claims, Marcion wrote a book called Antitheses. In this book, he laid out contradiction after contradiction between the Old Testament God and the teachings of Jesus. For example, you've probably heard the phrase an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, right? Well, that's something in the Old Testament that God says, specifically in Exodus 21:24. But Marcion pointed out that Jesus taught something totally different. In Luke 6:29, he tells us to turn the other cheek. And if we look in the book of Matthew, true, even though Marcion ultimately rejected that book, we find an even clearer example where Jesus directly acknowledges he's contradicting the Creator God. Matthew 5:38 says, "You have heard it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also." Why would Jesus directly contradict the Old Testament God if he was really the true God? Marcion points out many contradictions like this. Remember Isaiah 45, where God says he's the only God over and over again? Yeah, don't remind me. Well, in that same chapter, in verse 7, God says, "I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things." Well, hold on a minute. God created darkness and evil? That's completely the opposite of what the church teaches today. Marcion saw this verse as a huge red flag and concluded that this being must not be the true God, that there must be a higher God. So was Marcion successful in convincing others? No, he wasn't just successful, he was extremely successful. Bart Ehrman said Marcion had a huge following. In some parts of the Christian world at the end of the 2nd century, there were apparently more Marcionites than other kinds of Christians. But if Marcion was so successful and created the world's first Bible, specifically to emphasize that Jesus came from a higher God, where did the Bible that we know today come from? After all, it contains all the dark scriptures that the Gnostics and Cathars believed were inspired by Satan. Well, first we have to understand how other Christians reacted to Marcion. So even though Marcion and the Marcionites were pacifists and preached progressive ideas for their time, such as equality for women, a lot of the church leaders saw them as a threat. Tertullian and Irenaeus spoke out against Marcion and his teachings, and St. Polycarp even called him the firstborn of Satan. Ultimately, the early Christian church declared Marcionism a heresy, and his followers were persecuted and forced to go underground while Marcion's works were burned. So the creation of the Bible that we know today was actually driven by religious, political, and social factors. The Council of Nicaea, called in 325 CE by the Roman Emperor Constantine, played a critical role in this. Now, the council's main goal was to unite the church and settle religious arguments like the true nature of Christ. So even though the Council of Nicaea didn't literally create the biblical canon, it paved the way for later meetings, and over time, various councils and church leaders debated and decided which texts should be included in the Bible. Many books were left out, and those with different beliefs were branded as heretics and brutally persecuted. These early church leaders were not just focused on religion, they were also interested in gaining power and control. The Gnostics were also heavily persecuted during the early centuries of Christianity, particularly from the 2nd to 4th century CE, and it only intensified after the Council of Nicaea. They were labeled heretics, excommunicated, many of them killed, and their books were destroyed. But the Cathars received the most intense persecution. The church launched a campaign to completely eradicate them, leading to the Albigensian Crusade, which was a brutal military campaign aimed at destroying the Cathar movement. The first mission against the Cathars occurred on July 22nd, 1209, and it's known as the Massacre at Béziers. The Crusaders wanted to know how they could tell the difference between the Cathars and the Catholics. The military commander Arnaud Amalric allegedly said, "Kill them all. God will recognize his own." Afterwards, the Inquisition was created to eradicate any remaining Cathars. Those who refused to renounce their beliefs were often tortured and burned at the stake. The last known Cathar perfect was executed in 1321. The Bible we have today includes many of the texts that the Cathars, Gnostics, and Marcions saw as evil or misleading. They believed that these texts would deceive people and hide the true teachings of Jesus and the higher God of light. So the question is the God of the Old Testament actually Satan? And did the church unknowingly or knowingly create a Bible inspired by the devil to fool humanity into believing that he's God? We've seen that the Bible is filled with stories of God demanding violence, conquest, and bloodshed, such as the killing of the firstborn children in Egypt, the slaughter of entire populations, like in the case of Canaan, where God commands the Israelites to destroy every man, woman, and child. And these are all just a few examples of the horrific events described in these ancient books. But does that mean that Satan literally wrote the Bible? While the idea of Satan actually writing the scriptures is pretty far-fetched, what if we look at it symbolically? What if the true devil isn't some horned figure lurking in the shadows, but rather the darker aspects of humanity itself. Throughout history, these stories have been used to justify countless atrocities. Wars, crusades, inquisitions, witch hunts. People have been persecuted, tortured, and killed in the names of these scriptures. The Bible's been used to defend slavery, segregation, sexism, and even genocide, all in the name of a so-called righteous God. But was it divine will, or the human lust for power? See, the real Satan isn't a being like how it's described in the Bible, but a mindset that thrives on control, fear, hatred, and the suppression of truth. And this satanic force has been the god of humanity for far too long. In other words, the Bible's darker passages can be viewed as a reflection of our human capacity for evil, ignorance, and manipulation. The stark contrast between Jesus and Satan, the god of light and the god of darkness, reflects the inner conflict within humanity itself. So the satanic manipulation of the Bible isn't about a literal devil tricking us. It's about how the scriptures have been used to control, oppress, and inflict pain rather than to liberate and enlighten. It's a projection of all our dark urges. It shows us not the darkness of Satan as a literal being, but the dark side of humanity. We as humans need to stop blindly believing in things just because they appear in an old book. It's like retweeting fake news without fact-checking. That's incredibly dangerous. But how does one fact-check an ancient book? Well, by using logic and reason. Through reason, we can come to the conclusion that an all-loving God would never demand violent sacrifices and worship. Cathars, the Gnostics, and even Marcion saw through the facade and wanted to bring us closer to a higher truth. So the real power isn't found in ancient books, but in our ability to think critically, to seek out truth, to understand that the divine isn't found in fear and violence, but in love, empathy, reason, and wisdom. We need to really think about our beliefs, question the stories we've been told, and look for a deeper understanding of the divine in ourselves that goes beyond fear and dogmatic rules. So how do we do this exactly? We have the ability to reinterpret these texts in ways that promote kindness, empathy, and understanding, and to absolutely reject the parts that are hateful, divisive, and ignorant. It's important to remember that the power of any book isn't in its literal words and stories, but in how those words and stories inspire us to live better lives, love, and seek the truth. Remember that the power to uncover the truth and reshape our understanding of the divine is in our hands. Humans have been their own devils, but we are also our own saviors, and we must step into that role for the sake of our souls and the future we wish to create. The question is, are you ready to step out of a dark age ruled by Satan and into the light of a new world created by love, empathy, and reason? That's the new beginning. If you want to help my channel grow, become a member on Patreon or YouTube to access all our members-only videos. And if you're ready to discover how to reach higher consciousness rationally, check out my new book, Neogenesis: Dawn of the New Mind. The link is in the description. And I want to give a big shout out to everyone who supports. My name is Morgue. Let's create a new world.